We're recording this at night, under the light of my interior car light, because I didn't record during my lunch break today. We're talking about the two basic schools of thought for running action scenes, combats, usually in RPGs. And the two general approaches, and if there's any territory outside of these, I'm not really aware of it. The two general approaches are either theater of the mind or some sort of battle mat / usually grid-based combat. This may come as a surprise to you. I don't have a strong opinion between the two in any kind of absolute sense. Now, what I do think is that your RPG, speaking to my audience as game designers, because you are all game designers in my heart, when you're designing a game, you should pick one of those and really design for it. Because if you try to make a game that works both ways, you'll end up making a game that does neither very well. Case in point, 5th edition, the usual culprit of doing bad things. 5th edition D&D tries to make their game theater of the mind by default with grid-based rule, but everything is kind of assuming that you have a grid, but doesn't technically require it. It results in a lot of difficulties. And I'll get to this in just a moment. You can't really do. It's the worst kind of theater of the mind, and also very dull grid-based combat, because you can't support both very well. Theater of the mind has many advantages. Most of the games that I play actually use theater of the mind primarily. The main advantage, of course, is very dynamic positioning. The scene is going to go by really quick, and I'm going to refer to these as combat scenes, but just keep in mind that it's not strictly combat. This applies to lots of different kinds of action scenes. Anything that you would normally break a grid out in D&D for, you're probably going to would qualify as an action scene. So, really dynamic combat for theater of the mind. They tend to flow really well because, specifically, you are not spending time. I got this over here. Yep. I have a whole box of minis right over here because I use them for Lancer. You're not spending time, counting out distances and positioning and checking for cover and things like that. You're not doing all that stuff. That stuff slows the game down. It's going to slow it down a lot the more developed it is. So having a theater of the mind focused RPG allows you to skip all that stuff and say, just do the cool thing that you're supposed to do. Take your turn, do your cool thing, and we'll keep this moving at a fair clip. So that's the main thing. It allows for the if you're not tracking specific movements, you're sort of generally tracking, basic positions in a scene, such that you could describe quickly and narratively where everyone is, but not down to the exact position. That level of abstraction allows for a lot more narrative freedom for the players as well. For the players and for the GM, actually. There's a lot more stuff you can do when you're not having to check specific move distances and ranges and cover and everything like that. All that nitty-gritty stuff is all cool for tactical play, but theater of the mind isn't for tactical play. And I'm not 100% convinced that it ever really will be. Well, not in the same way. So actually, I just thought of this. Fabula Ultima probably straddles that line between them, because Fabula Ultima does not use positioning, it doesn't use a battle grid, but it is a tactical kind of RPG, just a different kind of tactics. Positioning obviously doesn't matter because you don't track positioning. So we'll get to that in a moment. So you've got the flow of the narrative, the openness of the narrative, both as big advantages for theater of the mind. The advantages for grid-based combat, likewise, are strong. People like making like important, meaningful, impactful decisions, such as, do I risk this movement to get into an advantageous position, or do I play it safe and go for the more midline or mid-level play? Do I, who's my priority target? Do I have enough movement and enough range to do the things that I need to do? Those kinds of things is sort of thinking about it like kind of like a board game, basically, like some sort of tactical skirmish game, is very gratifying for players like me and for many, many other players in the world. And you need like a visual representation to track positioning, to track movement, distances, cover then comes into play. All that nitty gritty stuff that I said you can ignore with Theater of the Mind. Like, that's the draw for like miniatures, battlefield based combat. Like, that's not strictly a bad thing to have. We like it. Like, people who like making tactical decisions, like me, I have very strong attraction towards tactical game mechanics. Those are good when they are done well. So in a game like 4th edition, in Lancer, these kinds of things are not just well implemented, they are core assumptions of the game, that this is going to be the focus of gameplay. Now, what I think you can't really do is try to do both. For the most part. Again, Lancer kinda does both in a way by focusing on what each one does well. By basically taking movement out of the equation. So the reason why 5th edition does not do Theater of the Mind well is because all its ranges are discrete and specific. You can move 30 feet on your turn. This spell has a range of 60 feet. These exact distances and dimensions are not conducive to Theater of the Mind, because Theater of the Mind doesn't want to talk about, how many inches, away am I? It wants to talk about, am I in the same room with you? Am I next to you? Am I far away? Am I obscured? These sort of general purpose descriptors, that's what Theater of the Mind does. Once you start doing like specific distances, specific ranges, once you have cover rules, you need to know exact positioning. Theater of the Mind is not exact positioning. And if you try to do it that way, then what it largely comes down to is, what do the players imagine versus what does the DM imagine, or the GM? And that is almost never going to line up unless the scene is extremely simple. By the same token, there's a lot of abilities if you try to account for tactical play in your game mechanics and then you run it as Theater of the Mind, you end up losing a lot of mechanics. Like, flanking rules are usually, or something to that effect, some sort of like basic assistance between characters. Like, that's really hard to do in Theater of the Mind without it just being always on or never on, because the DM, the GM is going to have some very particular ideas about what sorts of conditions will satisfy this. And anytime the GM's imagination disconnects from the player's imagination, anytime there's a misalignment there, like that's going to cause problems. It's going to cause issues. It may cause arguments. And the funny thing about the human brain is that it's very imprecise. It's a lot less precise than you might think it is. And so people kind of forget, positions might actually drift from between turns just because the GM either miscommunicated in the first place or just imagined it differently, or like their brain can literally say like, I'm keeping track of it. It's right here. I've got it. It's right here. That kind of thing happens. And so any kind of game that cares about specific positioning, specific distances, those are not good games for Theater of the Mind. So yeah, I don't have a preference. I don't have a specific preference between them. I like a lot of games that use Theater of the Mind combat, but I also get a real thrill in a way that can't easily be replaced by playing grid-based tactical combat. I think both have a place. I think you should play both kinds of games. Like, the variety of both is fantastic out there. the grid-based games tend to be a little bit heavier. They tend to be a little bit crunchier. But, if that's not a problem for you, if you're not like, oh, I only play rules light games, which is fine if you do, unless that's an issue, you should try both. Like, find a nice crunchy game. Pathfinder, I guess. I've said before, I'm not a big fan of Pathfinder 2nd edition. Never played 1st edition because I played 3rd, and I'm not doing that again. I played 3rd edition D&D, and I'm not doing that again. But Pathfinder 2nd edition, like, it's fine, I guess. If that's what you have to do. There's other games I would recommend first. Several games I would recommend first. But yeah, I actually like both. I'm not going to say that one is better than the other. They both have their strengths, and it is hard to mesh the two. Now, Fabula Ultima kind of is the exception to that. They just took the movement equation out of the grid-based combat and said, all right, characters are still going to be crunchy. They're still going to have, like, specific interactions. Like, this is not a rules light narrative first kind of game like Powered by the Apocalypse or Forged in the Dark. But it is also not a movement-based game. So, like, it's still a tactical RPG, kind of. It just doesn't involve movement. It doesn't involve positioning. So that allows you to run Theater of the Mind in Fabula Ultima. So I would say, yeah, I'd lump that in with Theater of the Mind. It's like 75% Theater of the Mind, maybe 25% tactical. So yeah, that's my take on that. I bet you thought that I would take sides, that I would have a favorite, because I have opinions. But my opinion is they're both good.